Before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a moment to provide a trigger and content warning. On Smart Talks, we often discuss sensitive and potentially distressing topics, including sexual violence, trauma, and abuse. We understand that these conversations can be challenging and may bring up difficult emotions for some of our listeners. Our full content warning pertaining to today's episode can be found in the show notes. If at any point in time during this episode you feel overwhelmed, we encourage you to take care of yourself, whether that means pausing the episode, seeking support from a trusted person, or accessing resources. Your well-being is our priority. If you or someone you know needs help, you can visit elizabethsmartfoundation.org for a list of resources, or contact the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-HOPE. Thank you for joining us today. Now let's begin.
We are excited to introduce today's guest on Smart Talks, Dr. John Foubert. Dr. Foubert brings decades of experience in research in the areas of pornography and sexual violence. He served for 5 years as the highly qualified expert for sexual assault prevention for the U.S. Army. He also founded the national nonprofit organization, 1 in 4, an organization that worked for 20 years to apply research to rape prevention programs on college campuses and in the military. Dr. Foubert serves as a member of the board of directors of the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, one of the nation's leading organizations working to end sexual exploitation. He is an interdisciplinary scholar with over 50 peer-reviewed publications. The author of 11 books, he has also testified before Congress and has been called upon by the White House and all 4 branches of the military for his expertise. He has been featured in media including CNN, NPR, The New York Times, The Atlantic, World Magazine, The Washington Post, and U.S. News and World Report. Welcome, Dr. Foubert.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Smart Talks. We're very excited to have Dr. John Foubert with us here today. He is an incredible person. He's done some amazing things, especially in this field. So intelligent. Just really happy to have you with us today. In typical Smart Talks fashion, we always just begin with a few icebreaker questions because we get into some pretty heavy topic matter, and sometimes it's nice to just start off a little bit lighter. Yeah. So I'll just dive in first. What is your favorite food?
Chocolate. Definitely chocolate.
Excellent answer.
We agree.
Answer.
That's great. Okay, if you had to choose between Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, which one would it be?
Ooh, probably Harry Potter.
What is your favorite hobby?
My favorite hobby is watching the news. I know that makes me sound really boring, but I'm a news junkie.
It makes you sound really smart, is what it is. Very academic and smart. Okay, do you prefer cold weather or warm weather? Or hot weather?
Well, I prefer warm weather, but if I had to choose between cold and hot, I'd probably choose hot.
Dogs or cats?
Oh, dogs. Definitely dogs. I was attacked by a cat when I was in high school, and it scarred me for life. And we've always had dogs. We have rescue beagles, and we just love them. So, yeah, definitely a dog person.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, we'll just move forward then and diving right in. Can you just begin by telling our audience a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm a professor. I work at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. I have a family, been married for 24 years and have 2 kids, a 16-year-old daughter and a 14-year-old son. I do a lot of research in the areas of preventing sexual violence and in documenting the harms of pornography. And I've been doing the research on sexual violence for about 30 years or so, harms of pornography about 15. And I'm very passionate about these particular subject matters. And I don't know, what else do you want to know about me?
Well, I mean, now I just want to jump in and be like, why? Why these topic matters?
What drew you to the field of sexual violence?
I have a very odd way that I got into the field, I guess. Odd in the sense that it's not typical. Other people asked me to get involved. I was a college administrator fresh out of my master's program, and there was a peer education group that was presenting sexual assault programs to college students, and they had a program for women, but they wanted to try and figure out how to reach the men. And they said, you're a man who seems to get along with the other men on the campus. Can you write us a program that will help us to get through to them on the subject of sexual assault? And I said, well, I'll just go to the literature. I'm a researcher, and I'll just figure out what program out there works best, and we'll just that has the documented evidence, and we'll go with that. And I went to the research literature, and there weren't any. There were people who were doing programs, but they weren't evaluating them. So I decided I would do what the students asked me to do, and that is to write them a program, which is called the Men's Program, How to Help a Sexual Assault Survivor, What Men Can Do, and wrote that in 1993. And got a lot of early attention for it, and it turned into the topic of my dissertation, and got a book contract before I finished my PhD, and it just sort of took off. We formed a nonprofit organization called 1 in 4, and did a lot with that. So it's meaningful to me, because I think the more you get into it, the more you see the harm that sexual violence causes people, and also I see as a researcher, there are definitely some helpful ways to attack the problem that we know work. And that's always been my motto, is to go wherever the research leads us. And so that's what I've been trying to do for the past few decades.
Well, now I just want to know, where has the research led you, or what has it showed you?
Well, I have lots of published studies, and I found that early on we focused on building empathy with among men for female survivors, and that was an effective method, and it showed attitudinal change, but it didn't show behavior change. And then the bystander intervention movement started to percolate, and I figured if I combined bystander intervention with our empathy-based program, maybe that would lead to good results. And I was able to get a grant from the U.S. Department of Education to study the program over 2 years, and to really take a look at an entire freshman class of a college, and take a look at how the impact was going with them. And we found a behavioral difference, which was the first study that found an actual behavioral difference in men who saw a program versus men who didn't. And these were particularly high-risk men who saw the program versus men who didn't. And the high-risk men who saw the program had a decline in sexually violent behavior, which I found really exciting, and sought to share that with others. And so, of course, I published the results, but also at one point even had 4 guys living in an RV traveling all over the country presenting the program. In the heyday of 1 in 4, which was the nonprofit organization that I led for about 20 years. And so that's that.
Do you feel like, as a society as a whole, we're improving, we're not improving, we're just staying pretty steady? Like, has there been like a lot of interest and change you've noticed over the years?
Honestly, I don't think we're improving as much as we should. And I think a lot of that has to do with pornography. I think the effects of pornography have really taken off in the last 10 years or so, as we've seen the introduction of high-speed internet pornography and smartphones and all of that. And that we know that pornography leads to sexual violence.
But could you like break that down a lot? Because I feel like Heather and I, like, we're like, oh yeah, they go like hand in hand. But maybe for our average listener, they'd be like, what are you talking about? Like, pornography leads to sexual violence?
So
like,
many people miss that connection. Yeah. So I think it's really important if you could break it down.
Let me be careful about how I say that. It's not that every person who looks at pornography is going to rape somebody. That's not the case. But what pornography does is, because it's so violent and non-consensual, it teaches people to be violent and non-consensual in their real relationships, because a lot of people look to pornography as a guide for how to go about one's own sexual behavior. And so there have been multiple studies showing that, particularly if a man is at high risk of committing sexual assault, if he watches a lot of violent pornography, he's much more likely to commit sexual assault than if he doesn't watch a lot of violent pornography. So the connection is there.
What puts a man at high risk? Like what makes a man at high risk?
If he actually drinks to the point of drunkenness 2 or 3 times a week, has other men who tend to support violence against women. So a lot of the trash talking kind of behavior. So he tends to surround himself with people like that. And in colleges, fraternity participation. I'm not an anti-fraternity person, but I am here to say that fraternity men are more likely to commit sexual violence than other men. So those are some things that tend to lead one to be at higher risk for committing sexual violence.
That's great. We use the bystander intervention that you were kind of talking about earlier. That's a big part of our Smart Defense program and what we teach. And we have a subset of that program that's specifically focused on males. And we're getting survey data back from that. It's kind of hard for us to tie that to behavior change now because we've just been doing this for a little bit less than a year.
Right.
But I'm curious, you mentioned at the beginning that your career kind of started looking at engaging men. And so I would love to know from your expert opinion, what are some of the most successful avenues to engage men in the fight against sexual violent behavior?
One of the things that I did was when I was working with college men, and that's sort of my bailiwick for engaging men, I threw out of like 100 letters all over campus to influential administrators and faculty and student leaders and all of that. And I said, I'm trying to start this group of men who will be a peer education group who are going to educate people about sexual violence. Who do you know who would fit the criteria of being a good public speaker, getting along well with other men, and would be sensitive to issues of men's violence against women? And I said, would you nominate someone for me? Or 10 people, however many. And then I followed up with each one of those individuals who was nominated, and I would call them up and say, hi, I'm John Foubert. I work at X University. You have been nominated by such and such a person to be involved in something that I'm putting together, and it can really change a lot of people's lives. Do you want to hear more? And they always say, well, yeah. They're a little, not sure, but that they're hooked. And so I talk about the research behind what we do and how we know it works and why it's important. And invariably, they want to come in for an interview. And I make it a selective process, which appeals to men. They want to be selected for something in addition to being nominated. And then after an interview, I decide whether or not they'd make a good founding member for the group. That's another thing that I've worked with in terms of getting men involved. If they can be a founder of something on their college campus, that's a big deal. And so I tend to have good luck in the beginning of recruiting men to be involved because they get to say, I was a founder of this group, and that's really important.
That's great.
Wow. Yeah.
So being that you are a researcher in academia and kind of like a scholar on this whole field across the board, what's one thing that you would point to that's a really big misconception that people have or the public has about sexual violence?
A big misconception is that women like to make this stuff up. And that, there's some, well, half the time maybe she's telling the truth and half the time she's not. I mean, that drives me crazy every time I hear it, but I hear it, and I said I'm a news junkie. I hear it on the news, almost on a daily basis. And that is simply not the case. We know from research that let's see if I can say this as simply as possible. The rate of false reporting is extremely low.
Yeah, isn't it 2 to 6%?
Yeah, right around 2 to 6%, and that in and of itself isn't necessarily a false report. What it is it's the unfounded rate. So that someone who goes to the police and says this is what happened to me, and then the police find evidence that contradicts what she said. And so they call it unfounded and they call it a false report, but it's not. Even then, it may not be a false report. But in all the other cases of 92, 94, 95%, we know that the evidence does meet with what she's saying. So, and of course, they're male survivors too. I don't want to leave them out, but the misconception in our society is that women just love going around making these sorts of things up, which is it's a terrible thing. And not only is it against research, it's just against basic moral values. I mean, someone has nothing to gain by saying I was sexually assaulted, because the world is going to treat them worse. And that's a sad thing, but that's what happens. And so it just doesn't make any logical sense to say, oh, well, women make this sort of thing up. They don't.
Yeah. No. And my hypothesis, I don't know if you would agree with this, but my hypothesis about that is that the percentage, that 2 to 6% that we talked about of false reporting, that's actually much lower, because we know that the issue of sexual violence, abuse, rape, these are underreported.
Yes.
We know that there are so many women, men, survivors that do not make the report, right? So if we really counted for all of that, the percentage of those false reports, I actually think, would go even further down. I don't know if you feel like that's accurate.
Yeah, I would say that's absolutely accurate.
It's amazing.
It is. It's so heartbreaking and frustrating. And yeah, like that is the worst misconception where victims are, that women just do it for attention or
money. I hear that a lot of times.
Or notoriety.
Right.
Like nobody wants to be known.
Not that kind of notoriety. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, I'm really curious. I often have this like little thing that I say, like, you can only be in the field serving survivors, doing victim services for so long before you are just dying to get upstream and talk more about prevention. And I know that's been an important part of your work as well. So what do you think, or could you give us a few of the prevention strategies, not just for men, but for any of us in the community, that you think are the most effective that you've seen in research?
Honestly, bystander intervention is where it's at in terms of actual and by that I mean convincing people that if they see something that might turn into a sexual assault situation, to step up, step in, and stop it from happening. And, if you, for example, if there's a young lady, she's at a party, she's been drinking heavily, some guy walks up to her and tries to take her to a private location. That's the time to get in and interrupt the behavior. Now, there are lots of ways of interrupting that behavior. It's not necessarily, hey, let me be the sex police and get in the way. I mean, that's silliness. But to go, sometimes silliness actually works, though, if you can do it with a sense of humor. But, to get in between the two and say, hey, may I cut in? And oh, you're trying to help her. That's a good idea. She doesn't look like she can do much of anything right now. Let me help you help her. So there are lots of ways of intervening. It doesn't necessarily have to involve the police or whomever, but it can. But really what the research is showing, I think time and time again, is if you can have an empathy-based experience in the sense of getting men to understand what a rape might feel like, and then combining it with bystander intervention, showing them how to intervene because they may not know or have thought about it before how they would intervene. That's a very powerful combination, and it leads to some really powerful results.
Well, another thing that I've been really interested in, and we've looked into a little bit specifically on the sex trafficking side, but I think personally for intimate partner violence, domestic violence, any type of sexual violence, really, I think it is such an important question. And oftentimes I feel like I have blinders on because I care, like our organization works with survivors, we're led by a survivor, and we want to help the survivors, right? And like I said, we care about prevention, that's so important. But on the other end, I'm so curious because of what the research says about generational violence and how one that was maybe in a family that experienced family violence or seeing that violence themselves can often, that's learned behavior, right? That they can then act out. And so I'm curious for perpetrators and abusers and these rapists that we've been talking about, do you believe, or has the research shown any type of rehabilitory program? Like, can they break? Because we talk about sexual behavior as being so, it escalates, right? Like oftentimes we talk about peeping toms and not turning it right. And then there's like step up. to violence. And then oftentimes, even after extreme sexual violence, it can turn into taking someone's life and things like that, right? So I'm really curious for you if you've dug into the research to see, oh, there are some really great therapies or modalities or programs that can stop that behavior or can rehab a person, because that is what I'm so curious. A guy goes to jail, serves his time, comes out.
Yeah.
I'm not really sure that any of us would qualify that as treatment for the issue, right?
It's certainly not treatment, although it can be good in the sense of getting him out of the society where he's perpetrating.
Yeah.
You know, but
Oh no, just to be clear, we're not anti
oh yeah, no,
prison time for perpetrators. We're pro that.
Yes, no, I assumed so, but I don't know of any treatment programs that have documented impact. And that is, I think, if someone wanted to do a dissertation that were cutting edge, that would be the topic.
Absolutely.
Would figure out how do we rehabilitate sex offenders. Now, I know people who do good work in the area. They're doing good work at the University of Pennsylvania in their counseling center to try to rehabilitate perpetrators, but I don't believe they have any studies on how that's worked. They just have anecdotal evidence, which anecdotal is helpful, but we need some peer-reviewed studies.
And some longitudinal studies, I think, too.
Yeah.
Like, we don't just want to show a decrease in sexually violent behavior for a few years. We want to believe that we've stopped it for the rest of that person's lifetime, or else they should just be locked up away from other people so that they don't have access to anyone to perpetrate or abuse or rape.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is just such a fascinating, like, it does just kind of make my brain spin just a little bit, well, maybe more than a little bit, quite a lot actually, thinking about all this. Do you feel like it is possible in our lifetime to actually see the numbers go down?
Yes, I do. I think if we are somehow able to convince society, whatever society is, that rape is a problem that we need to address and that we need to do it through the school system, and we need to do it with ways that have been shown to work from published research. I think there is comprehensive prevention programming that we can use with students at a young age and then at an older age. And there are parenting programs too that I think can help parents raise people who aren't sexually violent. I mean, one of my favorite ideas came from my doctoral advisor, and she would talk about how she would raise her son, and you know, she used to tickle him, but she would make sure that whenever she tickle him and he'd say, no, 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 she would go back and say, oh, you said no, that means stop. And taught him from a young age that no means no. So there are lots of, now there's no article that shows that works. I think there should be. I think we can start publishing more research in that area. But what's on the cutting edge right now is how do we actually change behavior on a societal level? And we need more societal buy-in. And I'm seeing, I think with so many of our visible public leaders who are not behaving well in this area, it's made it a lot more difficult.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, it is baffling that there's not more public buy-in. I mean, I feel like every couple years there's like kind of a little swell, but it's not like the tsunami that we need.
Right.
I mean, like Me Too, like it kind of like raised attention a little bit and then dropped. And then every time there's like a high profile scandal, raises attention a little bit, but then it kind of gets buried and goes back away. Or people are like, I don't want to hear about this anymore. But then when, you know, like your whole nonprofit, 1 in 4, here in Utah, where well, at least where I'm based, you know, it's even higher than that. It's 1 in 3. Like if you're not a survivor yourself, you definitely know someone who is a survivor, whether you like consciously know it or not.
Right.
It's just unbelievable that there's not more buy-in. Do you think it's just because it's such a dark topic matter that people just don't want to address it or think about it? Or why do you think there's such a I don't know, stumbling block to really tackling this problem.
I think it comes back to male entitlement. I think men think that they're entitled to women's bodies, but they wouldn't actually come out and say, "I think I'm entitled to a woman's body." I mean, they don't come out and say it, but I think that's the society that we live in, and that it's an insult if a woman might say no, so that men make up this fiction that, well, if she says no, she really means yes, and then they tell each other, and then that goes south from there. So yeah.
Well, a couple of years ago, I made a curriculum that was just based on consent and like trying to like teach what consent is, because I had found that there were so many survivors that because they were raped by a spouse or raped by an intimate partner, they did not put the word rape to what had happened to them. They're just like, oh, well, that's normal.
Right.
And I was just like, this is not normal. Like,
Right.
and it like followed them around and destroyed them for years and years and years. And so I mean, it is shocking at like the lack of education. I mean, you can still be raped if you're married. You can be
Right.
raped by your husband.
Right.
Like that happens.
Right.
You can be raped by an intimate partner,
Right.
even if you're not married. I mean, like, family members rape family members, unfortunately.
Right.
Like, as brutally terrible as that sounds, it's true.
Right. Right. No, it is. And I mean, most of the time the woman knows the person. They're at least an acquaintance,
absolutely.
if not an intimate partner. So this isn't a rare event. It is actually more rare that the rapist is unknown to the person who's victimized. So
So you are now the author, I think, of 11 books. Is that right?
that's correct.
11?
Yes.
So for our listeners, if they're interested in like diving more into the data and the research and all of that you've said in peer-reviewed journals and these methods and interventions that have been the most effective, out of your 11 books, like where would you recommend that they start? What should they read first?
Honestly, I would divide it into two categories, because I've written a lot about sexual violence, and then I've written 2 books about pornography.
Pornography.
So the ones I've written about sexual violence are older, and I actually have a copy of one of them that's a free download on my website. So you can buy it on Amazon, but you'd be wasting your money. So if people go to johnfoubert.com, if they can spell that, JOHNFOUBERT.com, and look under free stuff, the name is the men's and women's programs. And what I do in there is I document exactly, it's really written as a manual for how to implement research-based rape prevention programming for both men and women, colleges, military, and that sort of thing. If they're interested in learning more about pornography, the first question I'd ask them is if they're a parent or not. If they're a parent, what I would recommend them read is Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography, which is my latest book, which definitely helps parents talk to their kids about pornography, which is what I think is so necessary. If they're not a parent, I would just read the more general book that I wrote called How Pornography Harms. And those are both on Amazon.
It's amazing. Well, thank you for that. I think that's a great place for people to start.
Yeah.
I agree.
Thank you.
I agree. And I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, absolutely, yes, for joining us today, but really for like the lifetime of work that you've really dedicated yourself to. I mean, like, having experienced it, like, and then just being who I am, like, it's not a light topic. It's not an easy field to be in. So
it's not, but it's so meaningful. I mean, it's so meaningful to be involved in a movement that can make such a difference in people's lives if we really get together and go after it. I mean, I didn't want to be a professor who studied, the social habits of tsetse flies or something, something that only 2 other people would read. I wanted to take on a societal issue and really help people somehow make society better. And so sexual assault started me off, and then I got in to studying pornography because I saw the connections between sexual violence and pornography, and I wanted to document that, the harms, because there's so many people out there that think that pornography is just no big deal. Hey, it's something that we look at in private and it's can't harm anybody. Well, they may not connect that to their depression or their anxiety or their loneliness, or so many harms of pornography that are out there that we don't necessarily realize, hey, there's a strong relationship between this and pornography, and maybe we need to stop looking at pornography and start looking at it as the problem and stop looking at it as a solution.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love that.
I do too.
Well, I just want to say thank you again for joining us today. You've been fascinating. I've loved this conversation so much.
Thank you. I feel it just flew by.
It did. It really did. Is there anything else you want to add, or anything you feel like we missed or didn't spend enough time on?
Well, let me say this. There's a strong link between pornography and sexual violence, but that's not the only reason to be anti-porn. Pornography, it makes women into objects and not people. And it is something that can make men in particular, but now increasingly women, more aroused by pixels and not people. And that's something that's just very sad. I want a world where people using their own moral beliefs are having the kind of intimacy that they want to have consensually, and not to be influenced by a big business that's really trying to get them to believe that somehow sex is supposed to be violent, and it's somehow supposed to hurt the other person, and you're supposed to demean the other person. That's just not right. And we need to do a better job, I think, of helping people understand that not only does pornography teach us some bad lessons, it also has some bad effects in terms of our loneliness, our depression rates, our anxiety rates, and just general life satisfaction. A lot of the stuff that the pornography industry likes to say is it's going to make your sex life better. Well, in fact, it doesn't. And we've documented that in peer-reviewed studies. Or they'll say, you'll have a happier life. No, you won't. It's documented in studies that it lowers your life satisfaction. So there are lots of ways that we can have, I think, good conversations with other people about the real and true effects of pornography that really hurt other people. And that really hurt ourselves if we're using it. So it's time to stop. Yeah.
Well, that's all that we have with the addition that you had. So again, we just want to thank you so much for your time today. It's so nice to meet you virtually.
Nice to meet
by the way, and put a face with the name. And just for all of your time and expertise today, we're so grateful.
That's it for today's episode of Smart Talks. Thank you so much for joining us as we dive into these important conversations about creating a safer, more compassionate world. Remember, sexual violence affects so many, but together we can make a difference by raising awareness, supporting survivors, and advocating for change. If today's episode resonated with you, or if you know someone who would benefit from hearing this, please share it with them. Let's keep the conversation going because every voice matters. You can find more resources and ways to get involved on our website at elizabethsmartfoundation.org. And if you're able, consider making a donation to help us continue our work to end sexual violence and support survivors. Every contribution, big or small, makes a huge difference. And we'd love to hear from you. Connect with us on social media. You'll find us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and TikTok. Leave us a review from wherever you're listening. Your feedback helps us to improve and reach even more people. Thanks again for being here, and until next time, remember that each voice can spark change, and together we can make the world a safer place for everyone.